Let's talk about social clubs. They virtually don't exist in mobdom anymore, but they were quite the thing for a long, long time. They were bars or whatever, places these guys would meet, but they're dangerous, so they've gotten rid of them. They don't use them anymore because they could be bugged, as we saw in the case of John Gotti. They bugged them up in Boston. They could be bugged. Also, they could be put under surveillance. You could see who was dealing with who and so forth. So anyway, but there was one. It was the Veterans and Friends Social Club on 86th and 14th Avenue over in Bensonhurst in Brooklyn. It was for the Gambinos. It was for the Brooklyn fraction. It was operated by Jimmy Failla. It was his club. That's him you see on the crutches. The reason he's, by the way, in the photos you see him walking around on crutches, he had been indicted for conspiracy. He took a cop to plea conspiracy for murder. He tried to convince the judge that he was old and decrepit and he would fall dead within any minute. And he was walking around in these crutches. He used an air mask. It was all sorts of. But he died soon after going into prison. So I don't know. Maybe he wasn't kidding around. The club was frequented for a while by Michael DiLeonardo, Mikey Scars. He eventually opened his own club a few blocks away, and then he opened a second club after that. In 2000, DiLeonardo turned government informant, and he put away about 80 guys, if you listen to the FBI. That's what they say. Failla was a capo in the Gambinos, but he was a major power in that family, and he was a big power, probably the power, in the multi-million-dollar garbage hauling industry in New York City. I should explain for those of you who don't live in cities that what they did was, this is mostly in the 70s, they contracted out garbage hauling for commercial use now, so for restaurants and that sort of thing. They contracted it out, and the mafia took it over within seconds. In some cases, too, there are private contractors in New York City who have lines, residential lines, to haul the garbage there. Anyway, so although he made a lot of money in it, and although he was based in Brooklyn, him and his crew, they did loan sharking, also gambling, extortion. They were operating out on Staten Island, down in Manhattan, way over in New Jersey. He was wired deep into the Gambino family because he had been Carlo Gambino's driver when Gambino was the underboss for Albert Anastasia. It's interesting, by the way, that Failla lived through two episodes where Gambino effectively had Anastasia whacked, and he became boss, and then later on he lived through it when John Gotti did basically the same thing to Paul Castellano. Gambino appointed Failla to be his point man for waste hauling, and that's where it began. And by 1971, he was rich, and he was made a captain in the family. He's an interesting character. Although he was worth, the FBI says, about $50 million in cash. I once spoke to a Treasury agent, and I was talking about how much money these guys had. But, the agent brought up a good point. What do you do with $50 million in cash? So it takes up a lot of space. And they're waiting for you to show up with a lot of money someplace. Now, today, it's relatively easy. Electronically, you can move cash around once you've found a place to deposit it. Not so easy in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Anyway, he lived in this is Failla we're talking about, a little home, drove a junk car. He was terrified of electronic surveillance. When the FBI, bugged Castellano's home, they had the bug in a, Castellano held his meetings in his kitchen at his enormous mansion, and they had a bug above a lamp. They couldn't build a case against Failla because the guy just didn't talk. But anyway, he was terrified. He wouldn't have any landlines in his home, office, in the club. And that was tough to do, in those days. I mean, it wasn't like today. No one had a cell phone in those days. He was weird, too. He wore brown. They called him Brownie or something like that. I don't know. But he wore brown virtually every day. Kind of odd. Failla, he was... this is in 1985. It was Failla who was waiting for Paul Castellano at Sparks Steakhouse down in Midtown Manhattan when Castellano was murdered. In 1989, Failla took part in the murder of one of his guys, Tommy Spinelli, was on his crew. because Spinelli had stupidly testified before a grand jury, and he let it be known that he did that. And then, dumber still, he let it be known he was going to go back and reappear. But he's insisting I didn't tell him anything. Well, they're not going to allow that. Why take a chance? So he should have just been quiet about it. In 1990, John Gotti's on his way to jail. He appoints Failla to run the Gambino family with his brother Peter Gotti. Gotti, of course, Peter Gotti eventually took over the family, and our boy went back to running his own operation. But not for long. In 1991, like a year later, Sammy Gravano becomes a government witness. He implicates Failla in the Spinelli murder. So Spinelli knows he's going to jail. I mean, they got him dead cold. So he pleads to not much of a lesser charge, but a lesser charge, conspiracy, one count of conspiracy to commit murder. And he figures, he'll walk because he's old and it's not much of a charge. But bang, they send him to prison for 7 years, and he dies there in federal prison down in Texas. His club, the Veterans Social Club, was also near there, where Frank DeCiccio, who was a consigliere, I hate using these Italian terms, the counselor, the guy who went back and forth between various fractions and families and worked out problems for the Gambinos. Frank DeCiccio, he eventually became underboss of the Gambinos, and he was blown up close by the club, not terribly far away. DeCiccio had been close to Paul Castellano. He betrayed him, of course, and he wanted to hitch his star to Gotti because he saw Gotti was going places. He also saw that Castellano was soft. He was raised relatively wealthy. He wasn't a street guy. And Gotti had a sense of danger about him, so I guess he figured he'd go in with Gotti. By the way, I was told that Castellano really had a low opinion of DeCiccio. He said that he was a street dog, that he was nailed into his gambling habit. He really wasn't meant for management. He was better off walking the streets and doing crime stuff there. Who knows? Maybe he caught on. Maybe he heard Castellano say that. His father, he was Boozy DeCiccio. I don't know if they actually call him that. Vincent DeCiccio. He was an alcoholic from Italy. He was a soldier in the Gambino family. Frank DeCiccio's brother was also a Gambino soldier. His brother was George DeCiccio. His uncle was the Gambino hood, Joe DeCiccio. So Frank joins the Gambinos in the late 60s, early 70s. He's made a soldier, of course, almost immediately because, legacy. So in 73, him and Anthony Cassio, who would eventually run the Lucchese family, they start this ring. They're robbing diamond dealers across the state, in New York State, outside the city. Really successful at it. So what happened was, who approached who, I don't know, but DeCiccio did go to John Gotti and he said, look, Castellano is going to meet Jimmy Failla to talk about the Neil Della Croce problem at Sparks Steakhouse. They were going to meet with Neil Della Croce's son. Della Croce apparently was angry. He felt that he should have been running the family and blah, blah, blah. So they were going to meet with his son, talk it through, see what would happen. So he gave them the time, the date, and the place. They showed up. They were murdered, obviously, shot to death. Castellano and his driver, Belletti. And then Gotti declares himself the new boss, and he designates DeCiccio as his underboss, and he gives him control, I don't know why, of the white-collar rackets that Castellano had, which were profitable, had kept close to himself. From what I've been told, DeCiccio wasn't a guy cut out for that kind of work. He was more of a street guy. So it was not a bright move. On April 13th, 86, DeCiccio, he gets killed, as I told you. He had visited Failla at the Veterans and Friends Social Club. From what I've been told, I don't know how this works, Failla was a Castellano loyalist, and he felt also Gotti was really out of line murdering a boss like that. So they bombed him. They got Victor Amuso and Cassio, both of the Lucchese family, to set up the murder, DeCiccio's murder. They had been ordered by Vincent Gigante and Lucchese boss Tony Corallo. It was to avenge again the Castellano murder. They felt the same way, that you simply can't go around murdering a boss in broad daylight. It's who knows, because they were bosses. I mean, maybe somebody would try to kill them next. So they needed to send a message to Gotti to tell him, you're out of line. This is to put you back in line. Gotti, by the way, was scheduled to go to meet DeCiccio at Fela's club that day, but he canceled. And a guy named Frank Bellino, who was with the Lucchese's, happened to be with DeCiccio, or maybe had walked out to his car, and he was mistaken by the bombers for John Gotti. John Gotti wasn't a known quantity then. He was. Some people knew he was, but so in other words, when at the height of his fame, some guy in the street could pick out Gotti. In those days, not so much. So Bellino was blown up as well. He survived the attack. DeCiccio was murdered. DeCiccio was reaching over the hood, and he was handing him a pack. He was handing Bellino a pack of business cards for whatever reason. And Bellino took them, and then DeCiccio opened the door, which is where the bomb was, and bang, that was the end of him. Killed him. Bellino was badly injured. DeCiccio was denied a Catholic Mass, which was something the church started to do when the mob acted up like that.